In colonial South Australia, if there was a bogeyman, he bore the name Malachy Martin, one of the earliest murderers in Australian history who could be rightly termed a serial killer. Malachy was born about 1831 in Ireland to Michael and Mary Martin. With his brothers and sister, the family emigrated to Tasmania and then to South Australia, arriving at Holdfast Bay on the 5th of March 1837, barely more than 2 months after the European settlement had commenced. In 1839, Michael purchased a section of land between Willunga and Aldinga, which was named Somerset Farm. Along with his mixed farm, he also became the contractor for taking the mail to and from Encounter Bay. By 1844, his eldest son, Malachy, helped to carry the mail. Malachy, then aged under 13, was brought before the Supreme Court on the 4th of July 1844, accused of having stolen a half-crown and some ribbon from the post office at Encounter Bay on the 11th of June. A bag of coins including half-crowns, shillings, sixpences, a fourpenny and some coppers was kept in an unlocked cupboard at the post office. Malachy had access to the money if he so desired. He claimed in court he was not guilty. The money was noticed to be missing when William Carter, who was in charge of the post office, went to get change for £1. He questioned Malachy, who claimed the only money he had on his person was given to him by his father. Carter then claimed that Malachy had offered him £1 to keep quiet about the matter. Despite this assertion, as there was no proof that the half-crown found in Malachy's possession was one that had been in the bag, the boy was found not guilty. The following week, Malachy's heavily pregnant mother died in mysterious circumstances at the family farm, aged about 40. It was theorised in the newspapers that although she had hitherto been a woman of strong mind and active habits, and an affectionate wife and mother, the charging of her son with stealing had preyed upon her mind so much that she drowned herself in a waterhole. The official inquest finding was that she destroyed herself while labouring under temporary insanity. Yet in light of his later activity, it was more likely that Malachy had pushed his mother into the water during an argument, either in anger or with the intent to kill her. Nobody will ever be certain. The next mention of Malachy is his confirmation at St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church in Morphett Vale on the 4th of January 1846, the opening day of the church. It was the last time the newspapers reported anything sanctified about Malachy. Michael Martin still resided at Somerset Farm, but he had also bought a pastoral lease near the Coorong on the 26th of November 1846, and Malachy lived there. The Coorong is the name of a 90-mile-long saltwater estuary, varying in width from 1 to 2 miles, paralleling the ocean south of where the River Murray enters the sea. A correspondent in 1864 stated that Malachy had navigated a heavily laden whaleboat up the Coorong to Salt Creek in 1851. By 1855, Malachy had grown to be a disreputable young man, large and stout, with a stern face underlined by a bushy black beard. He was still working as a mail carrier, and one of his routes was from Encounter Bay to Kingston and Narracourt through the Coorong, on the only road between Adelaide and Melbourne, now known as Prince's Highway. The only building, a rough shanty known as the Traveller's Rest, between Meningie and Kingston, was then at Salt Creek, which had been built in 1847 on a slight hill with a swamp stretching out beyond it. William Robinson and Catherine Bracken married in 1851. He was a butcher and she was an Irish orphan nicknamed Nellie, who had arrived in South Australia 2 years earlier. She was said to be the most beautiful girl in Mount Barker at the time of their wedding. The first of their 3 sons, John, was born that same year, followed by William Jr. in 1852 and Richard James in 1855. The couple had taken proprietorship in about 1852 of the Traveller's Rest, which offered a place to eat, drink and sleep for those passing through this wild landscape. One of those travellers was a man named Bull. He had taken notice of Malachy, who was taking the opportunity to get to know Mrs. Robinson much better while her husband was away. He instinctively distrusted him. Bull was carrying £80 on him, which he hid in his boots before he went to bed. It was later said that it was Catherine who suggested to Malachy that Bull must have a fat wallet and be sound asleep at the late hour. Malachy took the hint and sneaked up to the door of the room in which Bull was sleeping. He tried the handle, but Bull had wisely locked it. Undeterred, Malachy went around to try his luck at the window. His luck was in. The window was open, and Malachy began to climb in. His luck ran out. Bull had been sleeping uneasily and was awake quickly at the slightest noise, and saw the silhouette of Malachy framed in the window. Bull punched the intruder in the face, and Malachy withdrew. Some versions of the story say he did not punch Martin, but that he had a pistol with him which he levelled at the intruder, causing him to slowly retreat back through the window. Bull latched the window and returned to try to sleep, only to be awoken again some time later to the screams of a serving girl. Bull cracked the door and peered out to see what was going on. William Robinson had returned, and caught his wife and Malachy together. Malachy had beaten Robinson about the face and then ran off. The bruised cuckold was now waving his shotgun around and calling for his wife to come out of her room and let him shoot her. She not unreasonably stayed where she was until her husband calmed down. He forgave her, as he had done other times before, and eventually forgave Malachy too. By 1856, Malachy was still visiting the roadside shanty and still making passes at Catherine. Malachy once said to Catherine, "You know that your husband is an old man. Should ever anything happen to him, will you marry me?" Her answer was, "I cannot say that, but I might." Malachy would do odd jobs such as mustering for William. In June of that year, Robinson had to go into the bush to look for unbranded cattle. Malachy offered to go with him and help out. It is thought it was the 11th of June that the two men went out into the bush in search of the cattle. When Malachy returned, he said he had lost track of William after they went in different directions. The next morning, Robinson's horse, Tom, had wandered home and was feeding. Malachy went out to look for Robinson, but came back saying he could not find the man. Catherine summoned police, and a search involving black trackers and locals scoured the scrub for the missing man. When William was found lying face down near the edge of the swamp, his throat was cut. Some reports say he had head injuries, such as might be inflicted with a metal stirrup. The blade which had been used to do the deed clutched in his right hand. Surprisingly, as William Robinson was left-handed, his hands were also free of bloodstains. Suspicion fell on Malachy, but the inquest brought in a finding of suicide. Nevertheless, Malachy felt it was better to make himself scarce for a while, and he left for New South Wales soon after. What he was doing there is unknown. Malachy returned from Sydney, and on the 23rd of June 1858, he married Catherine Robinson, widow of the man he had murdered. By this time, Catherine had a servant named Jane McManaman working for her. Jane took a dislike to Malachy and left her job soon after he made his reappearance. Jane McManaman and her sister Margaret had emigrated from Ireland in 1855. Jane secured employment as a domestic servant with Leonard Lovegrove, for whom she worked for about 2 years. Then she went to work for William Carter at Wellington, who was postmaster for the town and also operated a ferry across the River Murray. In 1860, Catherine and Malachy's daughter, Teresa Bernard Martin, was born. Despite her unease being around Malachy, Jane returned to help Catherine now that she had her new baby to look after. Jane's wages were 11 shillings per week. Meanwhile, during the period 1858 to 1861, a number of murders occurred which went little noticed at the time. In 1918, 82-year-old Edward Bright, who had arrived in South Australia in 1849, related what he knew of events in the Coorong. He lived in the area during the time, being questioned by a detective named Rollison about strangers in the area, and employing Jockey, who was involved in finding one of the bodies shortly afterwards, for a time. Local native people were said to be afraid of Malachy due to his cruelty and bad temper. If it is true that Malachy murdered a woman and a young man at this time, then that is completely understandable. The girl was not named, and nothing is known of the crime, except that she was rumoured to have been strangled with a stock whip. Mrs. Adams, who took over the shanty after the Martins, was in contrast well liked by the native people, and they confided in her. The story she heard was that an elderly tribal woman was tied to a bush by Malachy and left to starve to death. Whether this was the native woman he killed or yet another murder is lost to history. The young man's fate is better chronicled. Around late 1859 or early 1860, he had an argument with Martin, and it is said he was struck down by Martin using a wooden club. The body was then placed in a sack, weighted down with a stone, and thrown into a deep water hole. Native people found the body while bathing in the water one day. Although police heard of the discovery second-hand, they never spoke to anyone who claimed to have seen it directly, so no action was taken against Martin. The native people knew full well that Malachy had killed two of their own as well as Robinson. It was said at first sight of him they fled. Soon after, a jeweller was passing through and stopped at the Traveller's Rest. After that he could be traced no further, but his disappearance was not officially investigated. About a year or so after the man went missing, Bright and his nephew were in the area herding some sheep when they saw something gleaming white in a gully about 2.5 miles from Salt Creek. Intrigued, they went to it and found it was an empty jeweller's rosewood box with a broken lid. A piece of linen with the name G.F. King embroidered upon it was found in the box. Some time later he mentioned it to a man named Cameron, who admitted he had found the box some time before and taken some small tools which had been in it. While they were camped at that spot to the north of the shanty, Malachy visited 3 times just on dusk, each time carrying an American-style axe. Although nothing was said, Bright remained on his guard at all times. He had carved a 3-foot-long waddy, or native-style club, out of mallee wood, which he kept at hand while watching Malachy. After that, he and his nephew shifted camp, feeling they were not safe where they were. The next person to go missing in the Salt Creek area was a man named Harry Kirby, known as Harry the Horsebreaker. Not much is known of this individual, except that he stayed at the roadside shanty and was never seen again. Leonard Lovegrove, who was the former employer of Jane McManaman, spent the evening with Jane and Catherine Martin on the 24th of December 1861 at Salt Creek. It was the last time he saw Jane. Knowing that she was a good saver of money and that she put her savings in the care of William Carter for safety, he joked that she would have a long stocking by now. Jane, however, replied that she had not been paid for some time, as Malachy had been in debt the last 2 years and was paying off creditors. He had almost finished paying them, so she expected to receive her money soon enough. In early February 1862, Malachy suggested that Catherine take the children and go for a holiday with relatives at Willunga. On the 3rd of February 1862, a telegraph inspector passed by the Traveller's Rest at 1 o'clock and saw Jane. It was the last time she was seen alive by an independent witness. It is believed she was murdered on the 4th of February. On that day, the only lodger at the shanty was a German carpenter named William Wilson. He had arrived on the 28th of January 1862 and been employed to do some jobs by Martin. On the 3rd of February, he claims that Jane promised she would marry him in 2 months' time. Whether she really said anything of the sort to a man she had just met, or was joking, is unknown. Wilson asked Martin his opinion of Jane, and he replied that she was very respectable and very honest. Wilson believed she was hard-working and frugal. On the 4th, he was asked to go to Stephen Hack's farm and borrow a saddle by Malachy. Jane was in the kitchen when he left, but when he returned 4 hours later, she was nowhere to be found. Malachy was on the veranda, reading. He then informed Wilson that, "Little do you think what has happened since you went away." When Wilson asked what, Malachy said a man had arrived with a spring cart and 2 horses. He had his wife and 2 children with him. Jane got a lift with him as far as Maria Creek, on her way to her sister at Gieschen Bay. Malachy said he had paid her wages, and she took her few clothes and went. Wilson remarked that she must have had quite a bit of money owed to her, but Malachy refuted that by claiming she had been drawing on it regularly while living there. Not believing him, Wilson went into the kitchen to see if Jane was there, but of course she was not. He noticed a pair of boots she had been wearing that morning were behind a door, and some needlework she had been engaged in the day before laying discarded. When the carpenter said she must have left in a hurry to leave those behind, Malachy agreed. Yes, she was in a hurry. Wilson said she'd probably return, but Malachy said he wouldn't allow her to, as her departure while Catherine was away had inconvenienced him. Wilson then checked Jane's room to find it in a mess. He gave a songbook to Martin and said again how strange it was she left so suddenly, and that he had a mind to go after her, but was told he'd never catch up, as the party had intended to reach Gumtree Wells, 30 miles away, by that night. Malachy added she would probably go to Mount Gambier, where she could get higher wages. That night Malachy offered to sell a piece of silk belonging to Jane to Wilson, who said he didn't want it. The piece of silk could not be located after that. Wilson went to bed drunk, but in the morning he looked for the tracks made by a cart, and could find none. 4 days later he went to work for another man, before returning to the shanty. A letter sent to Jane and forwarded by her friend and former employer, William Carter, to Salt Creek, was returned with a written message that she was no longer resident there. This surprised and unsettled Carter. Feeling all was not well, he notified police of his suspicions, and took out a notice in the Observer newspaper of the 24th of May, asking Jane to notify him of her whereabouts. Carter was holding £50 for Jane. Police too thought something was amiss at Salt Creek. A police officer named Wakefield was sent undercover, walking from Wellington some 30 or 40 miles to Salt Creek dressed as a labourer. Once at Salt Creek he convinced Martin that he was a man looking for some work, and was given the task of putting up some outhouses. While doing so he kept a watch on the activity at the wine shanty. Heavy rains occurred at this time, washing away soil. A Narrandjeri man named Mickey, working as a tracker for the police, looking for an escaped prisoner, told another Narrandjeri man, Itawani, known to Europeans as Jockey, that he had seen something that looked like a white person in a wombat hole, partially uncovered by erosion. Soon after, Jockey heard that Jane was missing, and thought about what Mickey had told him. On the 29th of May, Jockey spoke to William Allen, the innkeeper at Wood's Well, who was in his stable saddling a horse, asking if he thought Jane had been killed, and telling him what the Maria Creek man had seen. The pair then rode out together to check the area. Allen was wary of being too near to the Traveller's Rest without an excuse, and asked how close the area was to it before they embarked. The men split up to search. After about 10 minutes as he searched the flats, Jockey noticed a crow perched on a tree, and interpreted it as a sign that something dead was nearby. Going over to the spot, he located the wombat burrow, with the body concealed inside. The burrow appeared to have been enlarged by someone digging into it, and tree boughs had been placed into it in an effort to further hide the body. He fetched over Allen, who took a stick and lifted up some of the clothing. They could see human feet underneath, and they recognised the dress as one worn by Jane. They left the area, and Allen telegraphed the police at Strathalbyn. He and Jockey returned with Corporal Rollinson and Trooper Wakefield 2 days later to recover the body. This time, about 10 yards from the hole, Allen located a length of rope used for tying bullocks. He was fairly certain it was rope he owned, which he had loaned to Malachy Martin. He had loaned him 2 pieces. One was returned, the other had not been. Rollinson proceeded to Salt Creek and arrested Martin on suspicion of murder. It was about 500 yards from the shanty to the graveside. Returning with Martin, the group discussed the best way of removing the body. Martin remarked that there was about 18 inches of loose material at the bottom of the hole. He knew because he had dug up a wombat from it 15 months prior. The body was removed as carefully as possible. It appeared the clay beneath had soaked up an amount of blood. The head was covered by a bag, which was identified as a flour sack with a Pavies brand, identical to a delivery made to Martin in January. Although the face was reduced to bone after 4 months in the open, Jane was identified by her large hands and feet, 2 missing teeth, and her clothing. The police corporal then returned to the Traveller's Rest and examined the building for evidence. On a kitchen wall he found some blood stains. A new cupboard erected there had partially covered the stains. Catherine Martin said the cupboard had been put up after Jane left. On the wall of a storeroom leading off the kitchen, another blood splatter was found, with a man's whisker stuck in the clot. There was also a stick found, which he believed was stained with blood. Wilson said in court that the stick had been used to remove the lampers from the mouth of a mare a week before, lampers being a swelling in the soft part of the roof of a horse's mouth. The only belongings of Jane he found were a nightgown, a neck ribbon with a brooch attached, a veil, a collar, a pair of stockings, 3 religious books, and a songbook. About 2 weeks earlier, Wilson had seen the boots he noticed in the kitchen in February, being worn by a native man. He had been given the boots by Malachy in payment for minding some horses for him. 2 rings belonging to Jane were found in the possession of Catherine Martin on the 5th of June. Walter and Julia Burford, shopkeepers of Wellington, who had employed Jane in 1858, recognised them as belonging to her. A diary, a daybook, and a ledger belonging to Malachy were also entered into evidence at the court. In one of the journals, Malachy had written under the date February the 4th, "Looking for the mail horse," and on February the 6th, Jane left for Mount Gambier. Rawlinson took Martin in custody, along with Jane's body, to Wood's Well and summoned the nearest magistrate. Magistrate Hughes arrived at Wood's Well on the 2nd of June and hastily convened an inquest on the body. Allen was confident the body was that of Jane. He had known her for 15 months. When he informed the court about the rope, Malachy was questioned. In explanation for the presence of the rope, he claimed that he had bought 2 goats from Allen, and that they had their legs tied, but that one got away near where the body was found. Having heard evidence from Jockey, Rawlinson, Wilson, and Lovegrove, Malachy was asked if he had anything to say. He said only that Jane had gone away in the cart. She said she would not have gone if it was against Malachy's wishes, but he had told her it was all right. The jury returned a verdict of wilful murder against Malachy Martin. With Malachy indicted, he was quickly moved to Adelaide. He and his escort reached Strathalbyn on the 4th of June, where they stayed the night. On the 7th of June, Malachy, accompanied by his sister, was taken to Adelaide Gaol by Corporal Rawlinson. Later that day, other members of his family visited him. Back at Wood's Well, Dr. Goss examined the body on the 22nd of June. He removed the bag which covered the face, causing the scalp to come away from the skull. He found a length of ribbon tied tightly around the throat and came to the conclusion that Jane had been strangled to death. There was no evidence of stabbing. At Denford's public house in Wellington on the 7th of August, Wilson had an outburst. At dinner he was crying and stating that his word would hang Martin, and said that he had seen Jane's body in a room at the Travellers' Rest. Later, while holding a knife and very intoxicated, he began to shout that he could not hold it in any longer and that it must come out. Pointing to the knife, he said that he and Malachy had raped and murdered Jane, according to a witness named Forrest. The publican Denford said he did not see a knife, and he heard Wilson say he had seen Jane's body, but not that he had harmed her or had helped to bury the body. Denford was closer to Wilson than Forrest was while he was making his exclamation. The trial of Malachy Martin for murder, and William Wilson as an accomplice after the fact, began on the 2nd of December 1862 in the Adelaide Supreme Court. The courthouse was packed to suffocation, according to a press report. Martin is said to have stood with his head hung down in a dejected manner, while Wilson exuded an air of confidence. As the trial proceeded, it was noticed that Malachy's brother was going in and out of the courtroom, communicating with witnesses, and warned to desist from doing so. A number of witnesses gave evidence through the day. The trial was adjourned at 7 p.m. and recommenced the following day at 10 a.m. At 7:30 p.m. the jury retired and returned just under an hour later to announce Martin guilty of murder and Wilson guilty as an accessory after the fact. Martin had nothing to say. Wilson protested his innocence. Malachy Martin was sentenced to be taken to the jail and hanged, and his body to be buried in the jail grounds. Wilson was handed a 4-year sentence with hard labour. Martin petitioned the governor for a commutation of the sentence, saying that he should not have been put on trial with Wilson, and complained that some of the facts presented by the witnesses were erroneous. The petition was dismissed. Martin never confessed to the murder of Jane McManaman, or any other killing, although he did state to the keeper of the jail that Wilson never saw the body of Jane. His wife and children visited him during December, and Catholic priests attended him constantly. At 8 a.m. on the 24th of December 1862, he became the first man in South Australia to be executed behind the prison walls instead of publicly. Dressed all in white, he walked up the steps of the scaffold, which was clad in black cloth, with the executioner and his assistant. They fitted the noose and walked down, leaving him standing alone for about a minute, until with a harsh sound the drop fell. A few heaving convulsions of the chest, and Malachy Martin was dead. After a jury examined the body while it still hung from the gallows, the legal ritual was finished, and at midday the body cut down and buried in the jail, where the grave can be visited today, marked MM 1862. But the execution of Malachy Martin was not the end of the story. In March 1863, Martin was one of 14 figures in a waxworks exhibit in the Norfolk Arms Hotel, Rundle Street, alongside notables such as the Prince of Wales and other villains like Madeline Smith, John Seaver, who had murdered Police Inspector Pettinger at Government House in 1862, and the notorious New South Wales bushranger Frank Gardner. For 1 shilling for adults or 6pence for a child, they could gaze upon the likenesses of the infamous while being serenaded by Mr. Gigney on his harp. In January 1873, the same or a different exhibition had Malachy featured in wax next to tableaux featuring Florence Nightingale in a Crimean hospital and the Maori Wars of New Zealand. Around January 1866, a shepherd named Orme was tending a flock at Sheoak Hill, about a mile from the Traveller's Rest, when he glanced into a wombat burrow and discovered a pick and shovel. Surprised and happy with his find, he dragged the tools out and then checked if anything else was concealed in the hole. His curiosity was rewarded with a skull and a long bone, either from an arm or a thigh. Orme left the remains in the hole, but took the tools, which he later sold to a cook. As he had made his discovery by himself and had nobody to back up his story, he kept quiet about the bones. Troubled by them, he did go back to the burrow some time later to find that sheep had scattered them and gnawed the skull quite badly. Finally, he related the finds to a friend of his at the start of April 1866, and from there the story reached the newspapers. The identity of these remains was never established. The name Malachy Martin became a derogatory term, noted a couple of times in newspapers. On the 11th of July 1870, a Mary Rogers was charged with continually using insulting language towards her neighbour Samuel Walder, chiefly calling him Malachy Martin. Walder in turn was charged with calling Mary an old horse. Both were fined 10 shillings. Elizabeth Boddington was charged with calling Bartholomew Malone a Malachy Martin who had hung 4 blackfellows and other less refined epitaphs in Light Square on the 15th of March 1871. Malone had used ripe language as well, as both parties found themselves fined 5 shillings each by the court. For years afterwards, travellers passing through Salt Creek had the old inn pointed out to them and regaled with a version of the tale. So too was the site where Jane was buried indicated like a revered monument to the horror. Ruins of the Traveller's Rest were still standing in 1966. Catherine Martin, it seems, never returned to the shanty. It is not known where she was for most of the 1860s, but by 1869 she was living in Kingston. She had 2 daughters by a man named George Ingham, whom she married in 1871. Catherine Ingham, formerly Martin, formerly Robinson, née Bracken, died aged 84 on Halloween 1915, and was laid to rest at the West Terrace Cemetery, beside her son Richard, who had died aged 50 in 1905. Malachy's daughter Teresa married John Hunter Laurie in 1895. They had 3 children, her son Richard serving in France with the 1st AIF. She passed away in 1924. The grave of Jane McManaman was marked by a jam tin and a can of stones, but eventually lost to history for some time, until 1966, when a surveyor rediscovered it and a local station owner confirmed it was the site by digging into the earth until he found Jane's bones. He filled the grave back in and set up a headstone and placed a fence around it to preserve it. It is ironic that the grave of Malachy Martin and others deemed the worst of the South Australian community and excluded from it by execution should remain inviolate forever by virtue of being located in the heritage precinct of the old Adelaide Jail, when the graves of so many others are lost due to neglect or cemetery reuse after just a few decades. While increasingly inaccurate versions of the case continued to be published in newspapers over the years, Eventually the case slipped from public consciousness, although interest in it has been renewed over recent decades. Martin Wash Pool, a large lake near Salt Creek, is claimed to have been named after Malachy Martin due to a fanciful legend of him washing the blood of his victims off his hands in its waters. It is thought that the lake is actually named after Malachy's father. A play very loosely based on the case called Salt Creek Murders was written by Melissa Reeves in 2002. Lucy Trelaw, a descendant of one of the local station owners, wrote an historical novel called Salt Creek in 2016, basing her fictitious narrative on the background story. A non-fiction account of the case was written by a descendant of Catherine, named Dawn Ralph, titled Murders and Mayhem at Salt Creek, and published in 2013. Although the full details of Martin's crimes will never be known for certain, reports of bones being found in the area added to the legend. Many of the bones were probably mistaken reports made when sheep bones were noticed, and imagination took over. Eventually it was claimed that he had killed 9 or 10 people, or more. He probably killed at least 7. His mother, William Robinson, 2 native people, King the jeweller, Harry the horsebreaker, and Jane McManaman. It was rumoured that another 5 or 6 unnamed travellers disappeared near Salt Creek. Others could easily have vanished out amidst the endless scrub and sandhills of the Coorong and never been accounted for.